Okay, so welcome to Learning and Design Masterminds podcast that bridges the worlds of instructional design and course development. I'm Sherry Conklin, your host, and with me we have Nick. Say your last name for me again.
Kroushl, as in it's crucial that you pronounce it correctly. Ha 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 ha.
I'm thrilled to be your guide as we explore this exciting intersection of these two dynamic fields. So Nick, could you just give us a brief introduction and tell us about your experience?
Yeah, so my name is Nik Kroushl. I use she and her pronouns. I sort of fell into higher ed accidentally right after I graduated from UNC Wilmington, and also sort of fell into the MIT program a little bit accidentally because I was doing a lot of stuff in Canvas, and then I was like, oh, you can get like a whole degree doing these types of things. Um, so ironically, I think that I officially like put down my deposit and enrolled in the MIT program. I think it was like the first week of March 2020. So right before like online learning exploded in a very big way and just had no idea. But I started the program in 2020. I graduated in December 2022, and I started my first official role as an instructional designer in May of 2022. Um, that was at the University of Pennsylvania in their medical school, working with a fully online professional graduate program supporting people who work as staff members in clinical research settings. Um, I spent about a year doing that and then had a great opportunity to get promoted to be the assistant director of the program, which is sort of the staff lead managing the program. And I did that for 7 or 8 months. I had been doing that for about 7 or 8 months. But that's still a role that has pretty high touch in terms of course development, faculty management, actually running and designing courses and things like that. And yeah, currently I'm very lucky to be on a work break learning Spanish in Mexico, and my next role will come along hopefully later this summer, and will be something interesting related to instructional design or learning design or something along those lines.
And that all sounds so fabulous, especially the work break.
Yes, it's very, very exciting.
So, in higher ed, I'm sure you have a lot of course development. Could you describe the interactive processes that you employed for course development?
It really depends on the project and sort of who you're working with as a subject matter expert. I've worked on some courses where the SME and the instructor are the same person, and that person is planning to lead a synchronous session every week. So they're already planning to have a lot of interaction with the students and be more actively involved in running the course. I've also worked on projects that are meant to be more at your own pace. There's not really an active teacher in the course. It's sort of somebody going through some training modules as an onboarding process or something like that. Um, Most of my experience over the past year and a half, 2 years, has been with SMEs who have day jobs in their field and are sort of teaching at night on the side. So they don't necessarily have a ton of time, and they don't necessarily have a lot of pedagogical training or instructional design training in terms of creating their courses. And I have found that the best way to work interactively with those folks is to figure out what they're comfortable and where they're at, and try to establish actual like synchronous meetings as often as I can with them. Some of them are really great about that, and they'll meet with me once a week just to touch base, 15 or 30 minutes, just to talk about where things are at. They're thinking about different concepts or how can we do this activity. Some of them it's less frequent, and I think it also varies a lot depending on whether they are a brand new instructor, which I think I've onboarded 3 or 4 SMEs in the past, 3 or 4 instructors in the past year and a half who hadn't really done much teaching before, versus somebody who's been teaching a course for a couple of years, where you're sort of approaching the design process as a revision and iteration rather than starting from scratch. I don't know whether that fully answers the question, but interactivity in terms of just having a lot of conversations, figuring out what they're comfortable with, where their growth edge might be in terms of different practices, whether that's with technology, with different types of learning activities, with refining the actual goals of the course, um, just a lot of conversations and a lot of evidence backing the pitches that you're trying to make to the SMEs who then have to execute whatever tactic you're going to try.
Sounds like a lot of soft skills needed.
For sure. I did not realize until I had my first formal role as an ID, specifically in higher ed, where you're working with faculty, how much it really is about being able to make a connection, figure out like what's the best way to pitch something to this person in particular that it's going to be most well received, and then how to I have joked in the past that even before I was an instructional designer, a lot of my roles in higher ed were really just about professionally chasing people down for things. And that has not let up at all since shifting to a more specific pivot and focus as an ID, sort of working with faculty. Yeah.
So when you're working with the faculty, do you help guide them through using like smart objectives or course maps or course outlines to strengthen their courses? And is that challenging for those who don't have a pedagogical background? Even for those who do.
Yeah, so I had a great opportunity to work with some brand new SMEs instructors over the past year and a half, and we did introduce a course map with all of them that really aligned the objective with the assignment, with the topics for the week, sort of a great grid there. And you uniformly, I think all of them told me as we went through that process that the map itself was super daunting to begin with, but that it was actually incredibly helpful once they were actually running the course and going through the weeks, their synchronous sessions and actually like grading things, and that it was a really helpful tool like once they got started doing it. I have been able to sort of introduce a modified version of a course map occasionally with instructors who already have an established course. But there were some folks in the program that I was working with who they just weren't the type who were, if I sent them a course map, they would not read it or do anything with it. Like they were going to talk to me about their goals for the course or some new activities that they were going to do, but they weren't going to sit there and map it out. So as somebody who really values like having a process, that was difficult for me personally to be like, oh, this person is not going to conform to the process. This is Oatsil, if you want to wave. Um, yeah, so that was definitely something to get used to. But I think that the benefit of having brand new people coming on board is that they don't actually know what our process is. They don't know whether or not we make people do course maps. So we kind of just pitch it like, this is how we do things. You are on our payroll as an instructor in SME. This is how we're going to do it. And that was super helpful. And then also, again, I think that once they sort of got into it, saw some examples, did the first couple of weeks, really found it valuable in aligning their objectives and their assignments and making them authentic and meaningful. Yeah.
Yeah, I revisit mine pretty often, but I find it extremely reflective, especially if I'm adding a new reading or something that's to make sure that not to overload students. I'm like, well, how does this align in here? Where does it go? And then what can I take
Yeah.
out? Because if you just keep adding, it becomes an overwhelming repository of stuff that's not manageable.
I think it also really sort of forces people in a good way to reflect on, oh, I have this topic in here, but I don't really have any way for them to practice it or for me to evaluate their understanding of this topic. Maybe I need to think about how I'm assessing this. And I have had instructors say to me, for them personally, that the course map is more useful to them than the syllabus, which, is the student facing document. The course map is really the bones and the guts of here's exactly what we're going through this week, down to like here's my lecture topics. If you're using lectures, which most of the folks that I work with do a fair amount of lecturing. So
And you touched on this, so it's a good segue. What are some common challenges that you face with the course development / ID projects, and how do you overcome those?
yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to just SMEs and instructors, and when those two titles are held by the same person, just their finite amount of time and resources, and sometimes their comfort level with technology if they're teaching online specifically. Um, in terms of the technological training, I've had the most success when I took time to sit down with somebody and just walk through Zoom, like, okay, here's like how a discussion board actually works in Canvas, for example, or, you know, um, there's lots of fun little tech things at Penn, but there's like a specific way that they need to log into Zoom in order to be automatically made the host of their own Zoom room, because we ran most of the synchronous classes through Zoom. So really just, I think, being available and having kind of a, I mean, saying it's a customer service orientation makes it sound sort of like wooden, but really just trying to be there for the person trying to execute the class has been really helpful, and just open to demonstrating things multiple times, or, walking through things. I think also sometimes there's a challenge in maybe pushing folks a little bit outside of their comfort zone in terms of a little bit in how they run courses, a little bit in how they assess things. A lot of instructors still rely heavily on things like attendance and participation, because especially online, they don't really want to be talking to a bunch of like blank squares with their videos off, or they don't want to be sort of like talking into a void where not a lot of people are talking back. But from an instructional design perspective, whether somebody speaks in class doesn't necessarily correlate directly with whether they have a grasp of the material and can do what you're going to be asking them to do as part of the assessments. Participation in class does not necessarily equal mastery of the content. And, also in things like assignments, a lot of folks, if they're teaching for the first time, sometimes they fall back to the things that they did when they were in grad school or when they were in college, which was mostly in person, and like a lot of things like, exams or like presentations, which can still work in different contexts, but lately, especially, and especially in graduate school, trying to move away from things like multiple choice exams, not only because of concerns from academic integrity and artificial intelligence, but also just because it's not the best way to authentically demonstrate the ability to solve complex problems, which is part of what the grad program I work in is trying to teach. And again, just a time constraint, it's much less time intensive for an instructor to use a multiple choice exam that's automatically graded in Canvas than to look through somebody's case study that they just wrote an entire analysis about and sort of give them substantive feedback about how they approach the problem solving process. So a limitation of time and effort, I think, from the SMEs. Solving those problems, I think it's just being available, being creative, trying to really streamline assignments so that maybe there are fewer, but they're to make them count, right? So that the time somebody's spending on grading and giving feedback is on maybe scaffolded and also sort of meaningful longer term projects. Sometimes it honestly ends up being like, okay, maybe this needs to be a group project, so there's fewer deliverables for this person to grade, and we need to figure out how to like alter the grading schema based on that. Yeah, did that sort of answer the question about some of the challenges? And
Yeah, and I was thinking, about, how you were saying that sometimes what they're assessing, or they put too much or an exam or a presentation. I'm like, oh, and that's where the course map comes back around, like,
yeah,
and can really help with, infusing authentic assessments, which when I was an instructional designer in higher education, I mean, if I could have had a penny for every time we said, well, that's why you should move to authentic assessments, because they would get upset because, and this is before AI, their
yeah,
exams be found on these different
oh yeah,
sites,
yeah,
and like you're using, what are you really trying to assess? And so I think that it does, yeah.
at
Yes.
this point, the classes I've been working on are mostly capped at 20 or 30 students. So I can imagine it's really difficult to do the authentic assessments in really large classes, where you have 100 or even 200 students in a class. Like that would be incredibly difficult to pivot from like an exam model.
Yes, and then, you have to look at it from the instructional design point of view, like you were saying, and the instructor point of view, and where can you meet in the middle? Because if you
Yeah,
can't timely feedback, then it's a moot point, especially
Yes,
if it's scaffolded.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's finding those methods. That's why I started doing checkpoints in my classes. As you probably remember, you're basically turning in a piece of the project and at least guarantees it's not the first draft that you're submitting at the end of the, and I like it because it's a continuous feedback loop infused. So I'm constantly being able to connect, but I get all the different disciplines that, well, I think you were working with one discipline, but I used to work with, history over here and communication studies over here in different sizes. Now, did you have to create any trainings for people, like online trainings for faculty, or was it typically?
Yeah, a little bit. We did a couple of sort of faculty development workshops for our group of faculty. So we did one last January, not this past year, but the year before, that I had a big hand in designing about universal design and accessible design practices. Um, my internship was actually creating, it was a asynchronous, fully asynchronous, self-paced onboarding for academic advisors at UNC Wilmington. So that was a little bit different in the sense that there wasn't any synchronous component or any facilitator or anything like that. Trying to think. I've done a little bit in terms of job aids for my faculty in terms of like, okay, you teach this course once a year. So the last time you logged into Canvas was 8 months ago. So like, here's a video reminding you how to take attendance or how like to assign grades or how to do announcements, like little sort of short things like that. Yeah, I'm working with a population, and I think probably anybody working with faculty is working with a population who is really short on time. So I have found I've made a lot of job aids, in particular, a little bit later on the side of trainings and faculty development.
Yes,
Yeah.
I can understand that. So in our program, as you remember, we stress working in a team because often you go into working in a team environment. But I think you were a solo idea or the first one in a company. And can you share your experience of that? Because
Yeah.
it's a different experience.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so the role of instructional designer was new in the department that I worked in. I was the first person hired into it. Thankfully, my boss had a background in instructional design, and I mean, she had been doing a lot of the functions of an instructional designer, but as a department of one, and the program reached a point of growth where they said, okay, we need another staff person to support the growth of this department and the course development in particular, so that this person who was the associate director at the time can focus more on, the student affairs and other logistical sides of things. Um, but it was definitely, it was a sort of a new program, or at least new to being online. Um, and there were some processes in place, but a lot of it was from sort of a skeleton crew perspective, where not a lot of it was fleshed out, or the processes used were kind of like, this is what we had to do to get it up and running, not necessarily where we want to be with things. So one of my first projects on the job was sort of reviewing some of our accessibility and best practices for that, and where we could integrate that more into the course development process and the materials that we have. Um, Luckily, at the institution I was at Penn, there was a really robust instructional designers working group. So even though I was the only ID in my specific department, I always had a giant Slack group of hundreds of people across the university who were either instructional designers or who had ID adjacent work or backgrounds. And I had a lot of communication with the Center for Teaching and Learning, which is sort of like the central hub of instructional technology and design consulting at the University of Pennsylvania. As well as I had some mentors so I worked in the medical school in a particular master's program. Medical school had one other fully online master's program that had been established for a couple more years than we had. And so I spent a lot of time talking with the IDs in that department about how they did different things, like what they had tried, whether it worked. So I still, even though I was a solo ID, had sounding boards, which is super important. And I think that for people who are solo IDs, at least in higher education, there are initiatives like with EDUCAUSE, I think, where they have sort of like brain trust groups or mentorship opportunities, remote mentorship opportunities where you can connect with other people and talk it through. Um, there were definitely times when I wished that like I had a team where we sort of could shop things around and have the context of our specific department, which differed from the other departments and disciplines in some pretty key ways. Like there were a lot of things that worked for that other program in the medical school that really would not have worked for my program because of some different operational things. Um, I had been sort of in a unique position for the couple of months before I left because I moved into the assistant director role. So we backfilled the instructional designer role. So it kind of did end up for about 6 months where we had two instructional designers on the team. And so that was cool to be able to have the specific context of the department, bounce ideas back and forth. But you know, there's also the context there. I had only been there a little over a year at the time, and we hired somebody from outside the department, so she was sort of getting used to the context of the department too. And yeah, I definitely hope in my future there's an opportunity to work in sort of maybe more of an agency style organization where there's multiple people who hold similar titles and whose job is to sort of work together and divide and conquer, or to sort of workshop things together. Um, but so far, that has not been the case in my not yet that long career, but in the past 5-ish years. It's definitely been oh, you show up and you figure things out. And that happens a lot in higher ed. You know, there's a lot of you show up and you figure things out, and then things get messy, especially from department to department, the silos. Maybe that also happens outside of higher education, but I do not have that experience outside of higher ed. So,
I think it does. I think corporate has a little bit more formalized onboarding, but you know, it's a lot of still, figuring out the culture and then making sure that what you design flows into that culture, because often you're trying to change the way someone's thinking through their training, like you said, um, when you have SMEs who don't have a pedagogical background, but you're trying to get them to teach in a certain way, but they want to teach the way they learned. So when you're trying to change that, yeah, I could see that. My husband's company, I'm not going to say it, but they just hired like a talent development person, so office of
mhm.
one, and
Yeah,
and a lot of times it stays that way for a few years until you can see the return on investment and that
yeah,
would benefit. But then these others that we're in teams with, they talk about the feedback, which is so important, in that brainstorming, like you said, and the sound, because you miss things,
oh
and
yeah, yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, I think also sort of when you're a team of one, like yes, a lot of things fall through the cracks, and you also sort of don't know what the norms should be or need to be when you first join an organization. Like a lot of sort of compliance type things, like you don't know what you don't know necessarily unless there's a team or like a set of processes or standards. So I think that was challenging too to come on and um, sort of figure out. I mean, like, where are we in terms of like 508 compliance or like the what do you call them? The substantive interaction, like the federal requirements for regular and substantive interaction for higher education programs, online ones to be accredited. So, um, yeah, I think it's really hard to do that as a Department of One for sure.
It is. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us, and we really appreciate all your insights. And so I'm just going to go ahead and say thank you for everybody for watching, and everybody have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to chat.